My name is Marcus Storm. I'm the chair of the Fabian's Defense and Security Policy Group. We're a member-led policy group who are generally a nationwide body of experts, so we consider all sorts of types of security, from traditional defense to new forms like cyber warfare, space warfare, and so on. Our goal, as with any professionals who are in the space, should ultimately be the minimization of civilian suffering and world peace. And while my friends often tell me that my New Year's resolutions are quite ambitious, but I'm very, very excited to welcome you all today to the best session of the day. And we have so many distinguished guests with us in person and online. And we're going to be talking about difficult questions because the Labour Party is ready for power. And being ready for power means that it has to answer tough questions that governments answer as well on a day-to-day basis. So the format of the session will be half Q&A at the end and half questions for us to explore the worldview and the perspectives of our distinguished panelists here. Joining us today, we have Peter Apps on the right in person. He's a global affairs columnist at Reuters. We have Arancha Gonzalez Laya, who's former Spanish foreign minister. We have Jess Toale, who's the chair of Labour Foreign Policy Group. And of course, we have David Lammy, who is was the first Black Briton to attend Harvard Law School, a minister under the previous Labour government, and currently shadow foreign minister. So I'm going to kick off by asking questions to our panelists. And we're going to start with, let's start with Arancha. So the first question to Arancha is, what should the UK do with regards to engagement with Europe when tackling global affairs? So we're talking about, let's put aside the important bilateral trading relationship for 1 second. So global issues such as what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. How should the UK, now being out of the EU, engage with the EU?
Well, let me first thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It's a very exciting moment, driven essentially by two big forces. Force number one is international relations that are much more power-driven, is the return in full force of geopolitics. Not that power wasn't there before, but now it's in its rawest form. And the second, and at the same time, and it's a bit contradictory, we are living in an age where what we need to learn to do is manage interdependence. We are living in an age of interdependence, not of independence, but interdependence. And we need to be very conscious of this in order to give to this geopolitical world an answer that is effective towards our citizens. This is the starting point for a relationship between the European Union and Britain in the area of foreign security and defense. So these are the two key questions that we need to have in mind. Now, if these are the two questions, I think the answer must be to leave behind the very difficult period we've lived through in managing our divorce and moving forward to build on the new relationship that we can have. The basics are there, but we need to make sure that we build on this relationship now and stop bickering and stop picking on each other and rather look forward, working together, because if the world is much more power-driven, we need to respond to this. And if we do this together, we are going to be a little bit more likely to succeed in shaping the response than in just being driven by the response that others give us. And the second thing I would say, so build a relationship, build on the relationship that we now have, and invest much more on foreign security and defense. I know that some were reluctant to do that in the Brexit negotiations. I think it's a mistake. The second thing we should do together is if we are much more interdependent, is work together to strengthen multilateralism, multilateral organizations, international frameworks that will be the most effective in protecting our citizens.
My next question is for Peter. So off the back of that answer just given, Peter, you're a journalist. So you've seen how information flow has changed over the last few years. Now, if we think back to a generation ago when Labour was in power, the main means, the relationship between the state and the people was very different because the means of communication were TV, radio, print. During the noughties, we had the advention of the 24-hour media. And in the tens, we've had social media playing a very large impact. In the future, we may see things like synthetic media, AI-generated media. So what do you think the relationship between the states and their peoples are now? And how does that impact the ability of states to work with each other?
I think that's a really, really good question. So, I mean, as I said, I'm going to take advantage of the shadow for a second to hold my microphone. So, I mean, I've had a really interesting couple of years. So I spent most of my life as a journalist, broke my neck covering the Sri Lankan Civil War. I became an army reservist about 5 years ago when they were looking for some specialists after the invasion of Ukraine. I got dragged back into government to do stuff with the military during COVID, looking particularly at just what you're saying, the sort of the big narrative picture. And I think we've seen some really, really savage shifts over the last 5 years, but particularly over the last two. The first is, as the first speaker said, geopolitics is back and it's really, really bloody. So if you looked at those sort of first few weeks of the pandemic in March, as the world started to shut down, you saw Russia and China that identified both risk and opportunity. And the risk they saw was both the sort of risk of lots of people dying and them getting blamed for it. The Russians and Chinese have been really nervous since the Arab Spring about their own people. So, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, two most authoritarian leaders to leave their respective countries in several decades, probably since Mao in China, and you've got to go back quite a long way in Russia to see someone with that much centralized control in the hands of Vladimir Putin, maybe even back as far as Khrushchev or Stalin. The West looks rocky, right? And democracy looks rocky. And I think there's an element of smelling blood in the water. So there's been some really kind of aggressive messaging. And that's done with everything from, social media, dark stuff on the dark web, to moving hundreds of tanks to the Ukrainian border. If you look at the way the Russians and Chinese message now, they do it with really, really aggressive hard power. And they also do it by undermining the things that we say we believe in, the things we do believe in, and making the idea of democracy look unreliable. The terrible thing about that is there's quite a lot of disinformation in there, but there's a lot of things that are true, and I think we need to be very aware of that. I know David's done some of this stuff on. Let's look at Kazakhstan. I think Kazakhstan's really interesting because it takes a whole bunch of the things that are happening globally, and we see them all in one place. So you've got massive wealth gaps. You've got massive elite corruption, and yes, you can blame the Russians for that, but we have an awful lot that we need to take responsibility for, particularly the way Kazakhstan has managed to move its corrupt wealth around. You've got environment and Bitcoin. It produces the second largest miner of Bitcoin. The power for that comes from really, really pollution-heavy coal power plants. So you've got a really dysfunctional world, and that message is being pushed it's an unmistakable message being pushed really hard. And then you see, yes, there are people who want a bit of freedom, and then you see that you come back to the hard power is what our potential adversaries use, and that's what they're using to crush that. So I think we need to work out what our narrative is, and it's got to be that democracy and pluralism works. We've got to work out how we're going to actually kind of defend that, where we're going to draw our red lines, and we need to actually be true to our own values and tell that story. Because when we don't quite do that, we undermine ourselves. Does that make sense?
Great, that's very, very interesting. And the question I have for David after my question to Jess is about military intervention. Did say it was going to be a difficult conversation. So my question to Jess, who's an expert in international development, is, Jess, we just spoke about, Peter just spoken about hard power and the potential uses of it and the real uses of it that are happening today. As somebody who's very well versed in the field of international development, what do you think about the deployment of British soft power? What forms does that take? For example, there were proposals, well, it ranges all the way from foreign aid, direct giving, to building new white ships, basically floating hospital ships. So what is your opinion? What is the future of British soft power? You're on mute, Jess. It's been 2 years and we all still...
It was going to happen to someone. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for having me. I was hoping to be in the room with you today, but here I am on the screen. It's an interesting question about soft power because it's undeniable that it's one of the UK's biggest assets. If you travel anywhere in the world, you will be asked about David Beckham, about Harry Potter, about Sherlock was one that surprised me not too long ago. And people take a real interest in what's happening in the UK, both politically and culturally. And it's certainly an example of something where our tentacles stretch much farther than would for another country of comparable size or influence. So I think it definitely has to be a core pillar of what we consider to be our reach to the world, but also a core pillar of sort of building relationships along cultural lines with other allies and other sort of like-minded countries. So I think it's part of a strategy that we need to have in our international development, rather in our foreign policy, which is focused around sort of three areas. The first is cooperation, because Arancha said, you know, we've never been more interdependent, but the UK is sort of forging this course now where we want to be independent, but we've made ourselves very isolated as a result. The second part is that our foreign policy has to be consistent, and this will help to address some of the issues that Peter raised there with those attacks that happen on democracy and on the West. And that's, you know, consistent with allies and consistent with adversaries as well. And the third part is it being coherent. And a huge part of that is ensuring that our departments are all linked up so that Treasury, Foreign Office, DCMS are all sort of singing off the same hymn sheet for whatever issue it is that we're dealing with. And culture kind of cuts across that. And I think it's worth noting at this point that we often forget, but foreign policy is actually a tool that we have to promote a more progressive domestic agenda as well. And it always has to come back to supporting that domestic agenda as well as being something that we promote externally in the world. And for far too long, thinking about soft power, or rather our foreign policy, has been something that's been seen as separate. And so soft power fits very nicely into that because it allows us to talk about the things that we as Brits are very proud of and do very well, and also enables us to focus our minds a bit on those things that we want to protect, that we see as very strong institutions. And of course, those are things like the British Council, the BBC, our universities, our science and technology, our legal system. And so they're all things that we should be immensely proud of, but can also be part of our package of our engagement with the world.
Thank you, Jess. And the last question is for David, and it's around the framework around military intervention. So one of the toughest things, which has always been reported by political leaders, is the decision to enter military conflict. In 1999, a British Prime Minister set out a doctrine governing military engagements in Chicago. And there were 5 principles stated, which he said they would have to be satisfied in order for Britain to go to war. And those 5 were, firstly, is there a clear objective? Secondly, have diplomatic options been exhausted? Thirdly, are military actions possible? Fourthly, are we prepared for the long term? And fifthly, is this in our national interest? Given the state of British politics at the moment and the volatility, we could see, David, you becoming the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs very soon. And I want to know that what would your framework be for judging military intervention for Britain?
I think that framework that was just set out is the correct one, but I really think that we ought to be very, very careful about sort of putting young men and women into conflict without exploring all the diplomatic and political channels that are possible. So if you don't mind, yes, we're living in very serious times, but none of us want to see lives lost. I've just come back from Ukraine. Yesterday I stood outside the cathedral in Kiev, where there is a very long wall of young Ukrainian men and women who have lost their lives since the aggression, the annexing, the incursions of Vladimir Putin. And it brought home to me, one, that if there were to be further action by Putin in the coming days, the Ukrainians will fight hard for their country. And they need our support in that. And we have to be united, we have to have resolve, and we have to stand up to this consistent and constant aggression from Putin. We have made clear that there will be very, very serious sanctions. We can cut Russia out of the international financial system, and we won't hesitate to do that. And Labour would support such a move. And we must be clear that where we see this consistent and constant aggression and interference in democracies, and we saw cyber attacks just yesterday, we have to act. And for that reason, we have to be serious in our own country about the Russia report and about foreign interference in our own democracy, about oligarchs that are all over political parties and are serious actors in state, oligarchs who still have significant reach into the Kremlin, and these people have to be outed, their assets frozen. We've got to get serious if we are to stand with the Ukrainian people at this time. So we must explore all diplomatic channels. That means being an active force in NATO. It means being in active cooperation with our European brothers and sisters in the European Union. This is not the time for spats with the French about fish. This is not the time for saber rattling about men and women and families, children losing their lives as they cross the English Channel. This is a time for cooperation. It's always a challenge when you have democratic states where there can be different political opinions, and getting the business of multilateralism to work can be a challenge. Of course it can, up against authoritarian states where a dictator effectively says, this is the way it's been. But we have to ask ourselves at this time, is it a challenge worth fighting for? What the Ukrainians want is democracy, and that journey to democracy, and it's for them to determine the sovereignty of their future and what alliances they want. And the question for us is, given the lives that have been lost, British lives lost in 2 wars on the European continent, how seriously do we take democracy at this moment? How seriously do we take those Fabian values, those Labour values, those British values of internationalism, multilateralism, defending the rule of law, and standing up for human rights that we birthed in this country? And it seems to me that this is not the time to play loose and fast with human rights in our own country or abroad. And this is absolutely not the time to have any foreign secretary sign up to an agreement that saves and protects lives in the Good Friday Agreement, and then put it on the table a few weeks later, something as serious as that. So I think that we must explore all diplomatic channels, of course, before any decisions at all about putting boots on the ground anywhere in the world. But it is absolutely right that we defend multilateralism, we defend internationalism, we defend the rule of law and human rights, and we get back to that position. As I travel around the world and speak to people all over the world, what they say about the United Kingdom is second to no other country in the world. You could rely on the United Kingdom for being reliable, honorable, and responsible in these issues when dealing with others. I'm afraid after this last few years, and some of the trivial nonsense, populist nonsense emanating from our own country and our own government, that reputation for reliability and honourability is in tatters, and we need a Labour government to restore it.
Thank you, and I'm sure that trip to Ukraine must have been very emotional when you actually see the events that are happening around the world. We're going to move on to the audience Q&A of the session. We're going to take questions from both in person and online, so please submit your questions through Zoom. I'll start with a question in the room. Lady in the black dress there. Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for your interventions. They're great. I suppose I have a slightly difficult question, specifically when we talk about sanctions. I've heard all of you speak about the necessity to clamp down hard on rogue actors and nations that don't behave the way that we deem to match our values. But we know that sanctions in many occasions don't really work. So we know that a lot of the sanctions in Iran haven't really worked. We know that sanctions on Russia haven't really worked in the past. What are other tools in our toolbox to tackle that and to, I don't want to use the word punish, but like to retaliate against wrongdoing?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to combine it with a couple of online questions in the same vein, and then we can answer them together. The first anonymous question is, can we afford to sanction Russia and China given their dominance over our fuel and manufactured goods supplies, respectively? And the second related question is, also anonymous, how do we square the need to demonstrate that Western democracy works with the need to bolster our armed forces, give them the kit they need, and improve their capacity and morale? So, would you like to
come
take
back quickly?
Yeah.
On that question about can we afford sanctions, there's a question, can we not afford sanctions? I remember marching along this road, or it would now have been 30 years ago, calling for sanctions against the ANC and apartheid and what was going on in South Africa. And I'm sorry, I'm absolutely clear that those very serious sanctions on the apartheid regime mattered, and they hastened the release of Nelson Mandela. So I think when we're talking about sanctions and international action, it is of course about the substance of those sanctions. It's about how serious we are about those sanctions and how consistent we're prepared to be. And it's also being honest about sanctions. Sanctions do not just hurt those that they are imposed on. They of course hurt the countries and nations coming together who put them in place as well. And we have to be honest about that. So we take a view. Do we want the Russian oligarchs' money? Do we want it sloshing around London and the housing market? Or do we say, no, That money we do not want, knowing that, yes, it has an effect on our own economy, but it is a price worth paying for the democracy and the values that we have fought for consistently over many, many years. And it's the doublespeak. It's the doublespeak that we're hearing from this government that I think it is the problem. And let's just also, I should say, on Ukraine, if Putin miscalculates, and I think it's a huge miscalculation that he might be making, a miscalculation because my knowledge of Ukraine, and my visit this week was not the first time I've been to Ukraine, is that it will be a very bloody battle, and there will be many young Russians that lose their lives. And two, if his attempt is to undermine NATO, guess what? If you're sitting in Sweden, you're making a phone call to join. If you're in the Baltic states and you're not in, can we be in as well? So actually what it will it will consolidate NATO, and yes, defensively, it will be important for the NATO alliance to assemble the appropriate personnel in the right places to equip, we've already said, we'll equip the Ukrainians with the malware and the technologies to deal with the cyber. It will actually consolidate opinion, galvanize opinion, make it stronger if he were to act in the coming days.
I mean, it's always going to be an ongoing game of chess, right? If sanctions start working, then the other side is going to adapt to them. So it's a matter of being smart. And there's good news here, right? There's some of the stuff we're good at, and the European Union has also been really quite effective with some of the stuff on, say, Belarus. Weaponization and migration into Belarus. What's the answer? Well, you pressure Middle Eastern countries to stop flying to Minsk. Really quite effective and really quite quick. So there's some stuff we're really quite good on here. We can do quite a lot with Russian oil and gas. London is the center of the international financial system. As David said, that's a real opportunity to inflict some pain on some of these people when you need to. Point of sanctions, you're trying to bring change, right? Extend a hand to countries that you want to bring back on board, is where, we can reach out to people who are adversaries on, but, we can't afford not to be tough with Russia and China, but we also can't afford a world that becomes totally binary and is just really dangerous, authoritarian, and with no way back, because that's really dangerous.
Do you have any questions for either Arancha or Jess?
Can I come in just on that last question about sanctions?
Of course.
I just want to tell a story, actually. So I completely agree with David that, it's about being consistent. It's about working in tandem with other people, and about being honest about the impacts that it has on the nations that they're the target of sanctions, but also on ourselves, and that price worth paying. But, there's a very nice story about how a principled approach proved the naysayers wrong, in that Sweden, when they introduced their feminist foreign policy approach, one of their headline policies was to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Now, arms trade, arms sales, and the arms industry in Sweden is one of the biggest parts of their economy. And so, as you can imagine, everybody went up in arms. Why are you about to destroy our economy? And they found that as a result of making that principled approach and principled decision, that actually the industry was buoyed by nations who they would prefer trading relationships with, and it didn't have the negative economic impact that they had initially expected it would. So I just use that as an example of where there are sometimes these unintended consequences of and positive ones of taking a more principled approach to a really difficult problem.
Thanks, Jess. Any more questions for Arancha or Jess? I'll take two. So I'll take the gentleman at the back and then the lady in front.
Thank you. My name is John Bonnell, and like you, David, I was marching along here against apartheid, but I was also marching along here against cruise missiles at Greenham Common and in favour of getting rid of nuclear bombs. I am terrified that if NATO finds itself up against Putin in Ukraine, and indeed if Putin finds himself cornered, what does a dangerous man do? He's got those nuclear weapons still, and he will resort to those much more readily than we would. And then climate change would no longer be a worry for any of us.
Thank you. Could we take this one and then we'll go back to the panel tour?
Thank you. My question to Arancha is really relying on the fact that her own experience is in multilateral organizations. And I wondered whether she could say something about how the UK can act most effectively within them, and perhaps with some comments on how it has or hasn't done so in the last 2 or 3 years. Because I do think that for a power of the size of the UK, acting through multilateral institutions is likely to be more useful than relying on Harry Potter.
Arancha, would you like to come in on that question, and then if anybody else would come on that nuclear war question, a bit of light lunchtime discussion?
Yeah, I go back to the beginning of the conversation. We are living in an interdependent world, so we may not like some of the neighbors we have, we may not like some of the partners that we have in the international scene, but in an interdependent world, we need, as option one, as David was saying, we need to try and work with them, especially if they are systemic actors. This may not be the case of Russia on the economy, but China is a systemic actor. So the first attempt has to be at working together. Obviously, it's not about caving in, it's not about letting the others decide what you have to do, it's about engaging in a conversation to understand where there are points of commonality and of common interest. This is the case of climate change. China has understood that climate change is a huge threat to the Communist Party. Now, it may come from a different perspective. We may think it's a threat to our democracy. They may think it's a threat to the Communist Party, but we certainly have a space there where we can engage in a conversation to work together. Now, there are other areas where we have to draw lines. So where do we draw lines? We draw lines on unfair competition. And I think there, the UK and the EU working together in multilateral organizations to make sure that the rules of the game ensure for fairness is essential. Take what the EU is working on at the moment is an anti-coercion instrument that will give the EU the ability to respond to countries that are bullying them with unfair practices. Well, what about the EU and the UK working together to have this instrument together, to have a common instrument of this sort? And then we are going to have areas where it's not just about unfair competition, it's where we have rivals, where we have rivalry. And make no mistake, we are already in conflict with Russia. It's just that conflicts in the 21st century may happen without simply shooting a single bullet. We are in a battle with Russia, and this battle is being fought today on a hybrid mode. Just by simply raising the stakes, just by simply talking about the prospects of war, you are generating a whole dynamic internationally. So we are already in a conflict. And the question is, how do we respond to this conflict? And it has to be a combination. Again, go back to multilateral institutions. For us, making sure that we work together in NATO and have NATO be properly prepared is important. Work on the technology side to ensure we also have an ability to do what they are doing to us is an important space. And impose sanctions, of course, but let's not fool ourselves. It's not a single magic bullet that we have to use. It's a combination. And again, always try to start from a conversation, from a dialogue with the other party. And this is what multilateral organizations are about. And this is where I would hope that the UK is much more forceful and invests much more in the future together with the European Union to make these organizations fit for purpose. And the purpose today is a much more power-driven world.
Thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions on the armed forces online, which I'll ask together, and then we can get some answers from our panel. The first one is around the recent carrier strike group deployment in the Indo-Pacific. The question is, would Labour take a different view of defence engagement in the region? The second question is from Joanna, and she asks, we call on our armed forces a great deal as the pandemic has shown. Is there a need to rework the armed forces covenant to improve their conditions, as low recruitment and poor working conditions could be viewed as a risk to our security as we deploy the armed forces more and more in domestic situations? And yeah, I should say as well that they're friends from Labour Friends of the Forces. And again, as always, thank you for your service.
Can I just take also the question about nuclear? January the 4th was meant to be the non-proliferation conference in New York. It's been postponed because of Omicron. But I've got to say, it's deeply troubling that, as I understand it, the government was not planning to send any minister. And non-proliferation has not just been a tradition within the Labour Party. You'll recall that Margaret Thatcher and Gorbachev were engaged in non-proliferation. It's deeply, deeply worrying that this has slipped down the list of priorities under this government. But on that point, and it's a point we've got to be careful, that we cannot appease autocrats. We must never appease autocrats. Vladimir Putin signed up to an agreement, the Budapest Memorandum. And as a consequence of that, Ukraine gave up their nuclear weapons. If we are not prepared to support Ukraine, having given up their nuclear weapons, what message does it send countries like Iran about their nuclear ambitions? What message does it send smaller countries that might be thinking about whether they need nuclear weapons? It says, let's not bother because the West won't come to our defense, is what it says. So that's the other reason we have to stand absolutely firm. I think we must always be examining ways, particularly with the changing nature of warfare and the changing nature of our economy, to renew and support our veterans and those in the armed services and the covenant that we make with them. And so Labour is always open to listening to what more we can do in office. And I know that that's what John Healey would say if he were here.
Can I take the, I want to tie together the nuclear weapons and the carrier strike question because they come back to the one thing we haven't mentioned, which is America. Yes, avoiding nuclear war in the 21st century is like one of the top 3 exam questions of the next 25 years. That and climate change and the rising wealth gap are probably the 3 big challenges that the world faces. And there is a credible risk that it could go badly wrong. I don't think unilateral British disarmament is the way to make us safer or anyone else safer. I think it would simply encourage Vladimir Putin. The reason why the British and the French nuclear deterrents are important and are a lot more important than they were 10 years ago is because we do not know what will happen in the United States in the next 25 years. There's one thing that we do know is that the US is going to be very preoccupied with China. What was the US comment on carrier strike, on global Britain sending a carrier to Asia? It wasn't well done, chaps. It was from the Secretary of Defense. We've noted it, but we want Britain to pay its attention to Europe because our priority is China, and we want Britain and France and Germany in particular to pick up some of our heavy lifting in Europe so that we can deal with China. Now, carriers are useful for that. We put a carrier in the Middle East, that's an extra carrier the Americans can send to Southeast Asia. We put a carrier in the Med. That's, you know, you can support the Americans in Asia by doing all kinds of other stuff. But that is a really serious exam question. And again, on the broader picture, European defense, you know, the Europeans are beginning to get their act together on European defense. The Americans are, and this is a real sea change in Washington, really quite keen to see that happen. And we need to be plugged into that. We're not a member of the EU anymore, but that doesn't mean that we can't be plugged in to the defense of the Baltic states, which means irregular forces in case they get overrun. It means serious, credible forces to fight a proper battle. It means whatever we're going to do in the middle in Ukraine, because Ukraine is complicated. And for all David's comments about backing Ukraine, there are limits to that. It's not an Article 5 guarantee. You know, it's a lot of stuff that we need to kind of, you know, there's a lot of stuff to. But yeah. We've said publicly, or it's, you know, been publicly reported in the New York Times, that we're supporting them on cyber with the Americans. You know, American Javelin missiles, real game changer. You see these Russian tanks, they've got kind of scaffolding over the top of their turrets. That's because those tank crews are worried about being hit by Javelin missiles. That is deterrence with a small d, you know, and the other end of it is Trident and Trident successor, which is the sort of big end of that. You know, this is a really messy game, and it's not one that we can afford to lose.
Thank you so much. We've spoken about Europe. We've spoken about Russia and America. Now we're going to drop the C word into the chat, China. I've got a question from online, and I would like to take some questions from in the room on China. So I'll read out the question online first. What did the panel think Labour should do about the Chinese state's genocide in Xinjiang, crushing of democracy in Hong Kong, ownership of our critical national infrastructure, pressure on UK universities, and saber rattling in Taiwan? Short bucket list. Any other questions on China? I'll take the lady with the red mask over there.
Sorry, I don't know. Oh, well, sorry, I'm not used to this. I've often wondered if a way of countering China would be to actually manufacture more of our own stuff. China has a lot of power in some ways in terms of its economics. It manufactures everything. All the small bits out of everything. It all comes from China. No. Isn't it about time we start taking away power by actually manufacturing more of our own stuff?
Okay, so about onshoring manufacturing or reshoring. One more question on China, please. We'll take the chap in the purple sweater.
Hello, yes. I'm very concerned that obviously China is doing a lot of things that we don't like, as the other questioner has asked. The question I have is China is given 15% of humanity. It's half of the world's demand and burning of coal. We cannot solve a huge range of global challenges, everything from climate change to solving global poverty to solving global inequality, without engagement with China. So how do you all think we should engage with China simultaneously whilst having to deal with the climate issues, but also with issues we disagree with China on?
Can I get anybody, Arancha or Jess, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I would say the first thing we need with China is coherence. It's not to speak publicly and lambast the parts that we don't like, but then go back to the office, pick up the phone and start working on the things we like. We need coherence, and coherence has to be clear about our desire to work with China to manage the things that cannot be solved without international cooperation. And you've just said them. I would add to the list of climate change, health, international cooperation on development of poorer nations, global financial stability. If you look at what China represents into the global economy, or whether it's value chains, or whether it's international trade, we need to have a space where we try to dialogue with them. Now, there's going to be another space where we're going to find ourselves in competition with them. Our best bet is to make sure we have stronger rules of the game. I spent a big part of my life in the World Trade Organization. I can tell you this is an organization that China values. This is an organization that we have to invest much more on to bring China in a conversation with the EU, with the US, with Japan, with India, with those who want to invest in rules of the game that will fight against unfair competition. And then there is the area of rivalry, is the area of values, in a way, values and democracy, where we do not see eye to eye with China. And I think if we engage in an honest conversation with them, and if we are coherent, and if they see that we are coherent, we will have a better chance of getting a better deal of a dialogue with them than if we just say one thing and do the opposite, because they can see through that very clearly, and what they see is weakness. And when they see weakness, obviously they don't engage in a serious negotiation.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what Arancha said just there. Represents absolutely our most complex and challenging relationship. That's because it can't be represented in a purely adversarial form, and it's become increasingly important for us post-Brexit. We have a really long history with China, which still impacts the way that Chinese officials engage with UK government officials, and that still impacts the language that's used in the relationship. But we need to take an approach which supports our own national interest and those of our allies, but without cutting off China and without descending into any sort of ideological warfare with China. We in Labour Foreign Policy Group recently released a report on Labour's approach, or a progressive approach to dealing with China, and the recommendation was that we take a firm but not hostile line with it. So we always address human rights abuses where they come up. And as Arancha said, China would absolutely expect us to do that. They value strength, not weakness. So one of George Osborne's biggest failings was that he failed to raise any of those issues which the Chinese government expected would be important to Britain. But also in that vein, we need to pursue de-escalation in the Indo-Pacific region. We need to maintain levels of communication open with different levels in China. And what I would say is our China literacy in the UK is very poor. It's really important to understand the motivations of both the central party and different levels of government and civil society in China, because there are often competing internal priorities and incentives. And as Arancha alluded to, a lot of what the central party focuses on is maintaining its own power. So a lot of its decisions are made through that prism. There's a huge scope to work with European allies here on supply chains, human rights, science and technology, where we have competitive advantages. And I know it was Joe that asked the question, and he and I have had lots of conversations about rare metals, and this comes to the question about industrial strategy. China controls something like 95% of the world's rare metals supply chains, and those are things that are core components to our smartphones, computers, etc. And so there is a real worry there about the West's ability to compete in that market and to provide its own technological components and maintaining our own competitive advantage in tech. Another major area is ethics in technology. So unfortunately, China is winning the battle in a lot of places on authoritarian use of surveillance technology and selling that to other parts of the world. So I think there's huge scope for Britain to lead conversations with European allies on what ethical deployment of new technologies like AI are. And I think the final thing is, our universities are huge spaces and huge attractiveness to Chinese students. And we need to ensure that we're investing in our universities here to ensure that they're on a sustainable funding footing, so that they aren't sort of trapped by sort of scientific research investment, but also student funding malincentives, as it were. So I think there's a lot in there.
The mass incarceration of Uyghurs is the largest mass incarceration of an ethnic group since the Holocaust. If you include the use of forced sterilization in that, it fits a variety of descriptions of genocide. China is a partner. However, we have several red lines, and two of them are genocide and wars of aggression. If China chooses to shape the world through genocide and/or fighting a war of aggression with its neighbors, then we will cut it out of the international system the same way we have cut Russia out. Or the same way we will cut Russia out if they do the same thing. Now, that would come with an appalling cost to the global system. But I do think that Britain, and I think one of the things that David's been really powerful, this party is led by really good lawyers. And that's actually really, really important, because the rule of law is one of the things that we've managed to achieve, along with, not having slavery and letting quadriplegics live, that are actually really big wins. And actually, we've got to put some teeth behind that. So China, absolutely partner. We have disagreements on human rights. We have areas on which we will not compromise, and genocide is definitely one of them. And I think a war of aggression against Taiwan will be another.
Well, look, just to underline all that's been said on China, I think we should be very proud that it's the Labour Party that led in Parliament for the description of genocide because of the Uyghurs, to be absolutely crystal clear, and the government opposed us on those moves. I think I said at the very beginning that our internationalism and our commitment to multilateralism is key. I just want to underline that. We cannot act in relation to China on our own. It has to be done through the multilateral system. And I go back to sound, consistent, deep relationships with our friends in Europe particularly. And the treatment of the Australian economy by China, the bullying of countries like Lithuania by China demonstrate that you have to act multilaterally if you're to deal with those forms of aggression, particularly, and there is a sort of more aggressive posture that we're seeing diplomatically from the Chinese, where you can work with them, but be really consistent about our values and use the multilateral system.
Thank you so much. We're coming to the end of our time. If you enjoyed this discussion, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, do join Labour Friends of the Forces, Labour Foreign Policy Group, our Defence and Security Policy Group. We have, for example, monthly discussions like these, and we help MPs such as David with specialist briefings. The Fabians have been around since, 1886, and you participating in these types of events immensely valuable, because it's in these types of rooms that ideas are generated, politics is done, and ultimately the course of nations is steered. So a massive thank you to our panel, and I hope you enjoy the rest of our day.